And we're live. Welcome to episode 26 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm Kevin.
Hi, this is Adrian.
And we'll be your host for this episode on assessing Trump's first 4 months. It has been 4 months since United States President Donald Trump returned to the White House. There's little doubt that he is the most influential president that the world has seen in decades. But what really stands out? How have his policies affected Southeast Asia? And following up on our previous episode, what's going on with the trade situation between the US and China? Adrian and I recently participated in an RSIS roundtable to look back on Trump's first 100 days in office. But there have been even more developments since then, from the arrangement with China to rescinding the Biden-era AI diffusion rule. So we decided to hold off on our podcast episode for just a few more weeks. So, to get the ball rolling now, Adrian, what are your initial thoughts on Trump's first 4 months? What were the biggest surprises during this period?
I think it depends on when you ask these questions. There have been so many developments since Trump took office for his second term. Things from his dismantling of USAID, essentially, right? The ending of US aid programs, especially here in Southeast Asia. The scope and breadth of the tariffs that were imposed both on Liberation Day and also subsequently as reciprocal tariffs, which are really not reciprocal, right? But are designed more to advance this idea of balanced trade as opposed to free trade.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, the latest development has been the truce between China and the US with the tariffs.
Yeah, that's all true, yeah. I think what you mentioned, the tariffs, he's been talking about them for a long time now, how they're his favorite word in the dictionary. But the scale of the tariffs, not only in how many countries they were applied to, but just how high they got, was quite surprising to many. Because, during the campaign trail, he was talking about 60% tariffs on China. And then went all the way up to 145%, well, now it's back down to 30%. And who knows what's going to happen next. But beyond that, I suppose another issue that was kind of surprising for the first 4 months or so of his term is that lack of opposition. Because during his first term, the Democrat Party was, shall we say, very vocal. Now, though, aside from some individual voices, a couple of the governors, they've been quite quiet, right?
I think that is a function of the current state of divided government in the US. So the Democrats are in the minority, both in the House and in the Senate. So that puts them in a disadvantageous position in trying to delay or put obstacles in the way of the Trump administration's agenda. As you correctly point out, this leaves federalism or the Democratic governors to be leading the opposition to the Trump administration. And this is also a function of, I think, the current Democratic Party's sort of rudderless leadership-lessness. They are still trying to figure out, right, where they go from here. So we're seeing the Democratic Party undergoing changes within, and we'll have to wait and see which direction the party take. Those on the left, AOC and Bernie Sanders, right, wants the party to move further left. Moderates want to move the party to the center.
Yeah, it's clear that there's no real idea of what's going to happen. But I suppose, looking quite a bit further ahead toward the midterm, I mean, one of the challenges that the Democrat Party might face is that, because of economic forces, they do very well in the midterm and they decide, oh, this should be our narrative, We can depend on the bad state of the economy to drive our political fortunes, but that's not a sustainable strategy. That's just papering over a bigger problem.
Yes, it would be problematic if they misread or misread, right, what tends to happen in midterms, right, which is almost always the electorate punishing the president's party in Congress. So only twice in the last more than 100 years or so has the president's party gained seats in his first midterm. We're talking FDR in 1934 and George W. Bush in 2002, right? So there's a post 9/11.
Yeah. In that case, Adrian, I'd like to pick your brain a bit about China policy. So Are we seeing a coherent China policy coming out from the Trump administration right now? Compared to the China hawks in his cabinet, Trump might just be the least hawkish person on China in the White House right now. And what does that mean for the relationship between Washington and Beijing?
That's a great question, Kevin. And the long and the short of it is we don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So our listeners will recall when we had Jude Blanchett on a few months ago. Right. This was prior to the chatter about a summit between President Xi and President Trump, possibly in next month in Mar-a-Lago, right, to celebrate
their consecutive birthdays.
Their consecutive birthdays. And of course, this was all before April 2nd and the tariffs. So China policy is now in limbo as a result of the tariffs. And also we'll have to see what happens after the 90-day period in which Washington and Beijing are negotiating on what will follow up in terms of their tariff negotiations.
What do you make of that agreement between Washington and Beijing? I think it's more of a ceasefire between the two sides rather than a very substantive deal. But what do you think about the prospects for a broader deal to emerge between the two parties?
So I think you're correct. It is a ceasefire or truce.
Yeah.
It is, I probably wouldn't even go so far as to call it an agreement. Whatever comes out of those negotiations also has to take into account that there are still structural issues in the bilateral relation, which these negotiations on tariffs, they may include the fentanyl issue and other issues as well, right, still do not get to the larger structural problems that Beijing and Washington have with one another.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the broader trajectory of the relationship, competition will remain. It's just a question of how it will be phrased by the Trump administration. If past is prologue, I mean, they were the ones who brought back the term great power competition.
Yeah.
Right, with the 2017 NSS.
Yeah.
So I would assume that moving forward, there is still going to be continuity in terms of such a strategic outlook, and especially given that Rich Kobe is back in the Pentagon as well, given that he was also brains behind Pentagon's thinking in terms of China, right, in the first Trump administration.
And I think just to step back a bit, it was also kind of apparent that both the US and China kind of probably heaved a sigh of relief behind the scenes that this kind of temporary deal was struck, because the US was staring down the barrel at a potential recession. China also wasn't entirely unscathed either, despite what its officials say, because it's like the Purchasing Managers Index for April, it fell into contraction territory. So both of them had, reason to be relieved by this temporary agreement. But at the same time, what would you think about the longer term impact of the tariffs that Trump put on China? How has it affected, shall we say, US credibility?
So I think in both the short and longer run, it is clear that America's commitment to the multilateral trading system is just about
Done. Yeah.
Like-minded countries they have to work together basically to pick up the pieces and to figure out what is the next step, what can the WTO do at a very minimum to reform the trading system. We know the US has made the appellate system of the WTO unworkable. Right, so the rest have to decide what can they do, American actions notwithstanding, what is in their interests to reform the WTO. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
The region is, I think, fortunate that we have our own form of a lattice work of economic agreement.
Yeah. RCEP,
CPTPP, ASEAN and China are talking about FTA 3.0, right? There is a digital framework agreement among several countries. So there is a baseline for the countries to work together. And I think, now there is talk of CPTPP in discussions with the EU to work closer together. The fact that that is being raised, I think, is a good sign. There is also, I think, this certain wariness countries that we should probably also not be overly dependent on the US, right? So again, nobody is using the term decoupling, right? But in terms of being sort of more independent, more resilient, then we're talking about also de-risking from the US.
Yeah, it seems doubly ironic in that way. First, de-risking being applied to Washington as opposed to being pushed by Washington.
Yes.
And then not only that, but, if this pressure from tariffs ends up being the last push that China needed to be able to gain admission to the CPTPP and really take America's place in the deal that it played an integral part in negotiating, well, that's going to be quite an interesting turn of events to explain in the history books.
We're talking about unintended consequences,
yeah,
right, of action.
Yeah, that's for sure. That does get me thinking though, Adrian. Do you think that the current ceasefire between Beijing and Washington is sustainable, or are there already signs that it might be cracking?
I think both sides have incentives to see out this 90-day ceasefire.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, there are economic and inflationary pressures on the American side, right? There are economic and deflationary pressures on
the Chinese side.
On the Chinese side. So both the leadership in Washington and Beijing, I think, are happy that this ceasefire or truce took place.
Uh-huh.
I think they would want to see out these 90 days and while negotiations are going on. The question then is, what happens after 90 days?
Mm-hmm.
But, this level of uncertainty is not unique for the last 4 months or so, because it's also part of this 90-day pause of the reciprocal tariffs.
Until about mid-July, yeah.
Right, and just this week, signals from DC is that they are overwhelmed, and who knew that it's not possible to negotiate, right, 100 plus
agreements in 90 days.
Trade agreements in 90 days, who knew that? And so, right, we'll see what happens after 90 days.
But you're right, it might be a case like we saw with TikTok, where they just kicked the can down the road and extended it another 90 days. Or Trump might decide that, you know what, I'm just going to increase tariffs back to 100% to show Beijing that we're serious about wanting a deal. But that would cause its own set of problems.
And also, right, there are also developments in the US now. The court cases against the tariffs are moving through the court system. And also, late last week, we had the last of the credit rating agencies downgrading US debt.
Yeah.
S&P and the other already downgraded US debt much earlier, right?
Quite a few years ago.
But Congress is now considering Trump's big, beautiful tax bill to make his tax cuts permanent. But that's also putting pressure on treasuries and also on the US dollar, quite apart from pressures from the tariffs.
Yeah, you're right. That tax plan is going to be something we're going to have to watch over the summer. We'll probably do an episode on it later at some point too. But just to bring the conversation back to tech restrictions, I think it's quite interesting that it was reported that the Trump administration is delaying plans to add more Chinese companies to the entity list, even though they were, already planned a few weeks to a few months in advance, suggesting that, they wanted to dial back the tension a little bit with Beijing in pursuit of a deal. Beijing, on the other hand, is out there raising anti-dumping taxes on American imports of plastics by 75%. And those polymers were used in advanced manufacturing. It suggests that, the two sides see the kind of leverage that they wield a bit differently, but also that maybe there's a difference in how badly they want a deal or how they want to approach a deal.
So I think China clearly wants to demonstrate that they will not back down.
Yeah.
That much is clear. But, even I think with these threatened entity listings, they're not new. They happened under the Biden administration. The difference between now and then is, at least under the Biden administration, there was, right, this so-called strategic channel between then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. So they were communicating, and the Americans were at least telling the Chinese, this is what we're going to do and this is why we're doing it. The question we're now facing is there a similar strategic channel between Trump 2.0 and Beijing?
Yeah.
Right? And if so, who is the
point of contact?
Part of the POC for this, when we know Mike Waltz is out of a job and might be UN ambassador, and Marco Rubio is now double-hatted or triple-hatted, right, as Secretary of State, acting National Security Advisor, and USAID administrator as well. If there is a strategic channel, who is Wang Yi speaking to? Or are we, again, back to the situation in the Biden administration when Janet Yellen, then Treasury Secretary, was principal interlocutor with her equivalent in Beijing? So is Besant now primary interlocutor with Beijing? We don't know.
Yeah, not only is he the primary interlocutor, does he have the power to make decisions? Or is he going to say something and then get contradicted by Trump, by Peter Navarro, by Lutnick, or whoever else it might be in the White House?
Again, this presupposes that there is a unified policy, a unified messaging from the White House, when again, looking back over the last 4 months, that is not entirely evident.
Yeah. And speaking of a unified policy, do you see a kind of, at least shall we say, concepts of a unified policy when it comes to the Trump administration's tech restrictions on China?
So that's a very interesting point. So we had small yard high fences for the Biden administration. And for Trump 1.0, the sort of tech restriction policy was basically directed against China's national tech champions. So in Trump 1.0, it was ZTE and Huawei, right? So now apparently, right, sort of, I think Huawei is back, right, sort of within the scopes of Trump 2.0 with the latest announcement of export rules, the Foreign Direct Product Rule applying to Huawei's Ascend AI chips.
But it does make me wonder, because Trump was recently in the Middle East, right? And he's been talking about building the biggest AI campus outside the US in the United Arab Emirates, giving them expanded access to AI chips. It's probably very early, but how are we supposed to square this circle? I mean, despite his intention to compete against China in terms of artificial intelligence, there are national security observers in the US who are worried that this deal with the UAE could give China more opportunities to get advanced chips. But also, this ties to our discussion about Southeast Asia. How are we supposed to square the Trump administration's sudden and very prominent attention in the Middle East with this promise that several of his cabinet members have made to focus more on Asia?
I think from the Trump administration's point of view, these are not mutually
exclusive, I guess.
Exclusive. With regard to the Middle East and UAE wanting to build out their own AI development, and this is not new, right? The Gulf states are planning for a post-petrol future, and AI ties into that. So, I mean, this was one of the reasons why a lot of countries around the world, not to mention Silicon Valley, were opposed to the Biden administration's AI diffusion rule, which would have really crimped NVIDIA's ability to sell advanced AI chips to people, the countries that were willing and able to purchase them, right? So for our listeners, right, sort of the AI diffusion rule would have divided the world into basically 3 tiers, right? So that the first tier were close allies and partners, and they would be basically unrestricted in their ability to acquire advanced AI GPUs and the like. Tier 3 are basically adversaries. China, Iran, Russia. They will be basically embargoed from... And everybody else would be in Tier 2, right? Subject to compute restrictions in the number of chips that they would be able to purchase. And because of advances in computing, the actual number of chips would actually decrease, right? Sort of over time. So that would then, right, sort of create have and have not states in terms of AI development, and countries that will be on the frontier of AI development and those that will be laggards. So it's clear now that they have been very successful in lobbying the Trump administration to junk AI diffusion rule.
Yeah, to throw the door wide open, essentially.
Yes, and as you correctly pointed out, the critics have also raised the possibility that this will increase risks of diversion of NVIDIA's advanced chips to countries that are not supposed to receive them. This week, right, we had also Jensen Huang saying, right, it's a bit hard to divert advanced NVIDIA systems. Now they are actually not so much individual chips as complete systems. It's not that easy to also divert a 2-ton complete NVIDIA system right to countries that are not supposed to receive them. And there are also legislation moving to Congress that would place GPS trackers on these systems, right, that would allow for better monitoring of where these systems are going.
It sounds like this is going to be, a potential point of tension between Washington and Beijing, especially as they try to reach a more stable trade deal, I imagine.
So again, this is not new.
Nope.
And with export controls, it's always been a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Washington also has not helped itself by not increasing funding for BIS, right, in terms of the enforcement mechanisms. So you have the Trump administration acting at cross purposes. They want all these new export control rules, but DOGE says, we're going to cut funding for the Treasury Department, we're going to cut funding for BIS. It's trade-offs. And if you want successful enforcement of export control rules, right, I think it's only logical that funding for BIS would have to be increased. But if I'm not mistaken, there is no increase in the budget for the BIS for this upcoming fiscal year.
Yeah, and it's a tale that's kind of reverberated throughout the American civil service too, especially with all the cuts that DOGE has put in place.
Yes.
Although speaking of all these topics, Adrian, I think it kind of brings us towards the central focus of our podcast series. How have the Trump administration's policies in its first 4 months affected US engagement with Southeast Asia? I think, like, for example, you mentioned DOGE and the cutting of US aid. How has that affected Southeast Asia alongside tariffs? Were there any other important policies that really had big impacts on this region?
So in the longer term, the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords is problematic, given that the region is one of the most vulnerable to climate change.
Yeah.
The withdrawal from the just energy transition programs, right? It's going to affect both Indonesia and Vietnam's ability to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy.
Yeah.
That is just an additional spur for the region to get its act together. There's been talk of sort of microreactors and other forms of renewables. Also leaves the door open for China to make inroads, right? Especially with clean energy tech, where they already have a big advantage, right, in terms of EVs and batteries and hydro, right, especially on mainland Southeast Asia. So these are unfortunate strategic own goals by the US. And our listeners know as well, right, our friends over at RSIS, right, sort of run their annual survey on the state of Southeast Asia. And the last results was the US had sort of regained at least a minimal advantage, right, sort of over China in terms of favorability, right? And I'll just go out on a limb here and say it will probably not last into the next sort of iteration of the survey, right? Again, it's past its prologue. We saw a slump in favorable attitudes towards the US under Trump 1.0, and I would certainly expect to see the same this time again.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember the launch event for that report was probably, depending on how you want to look at it, very fortunately timed or very unfortunately timed, because it was the same day as the Liberation Day tariffs. So it was something that they all wanted to talk about, but couldn't be included in the survey. That said, though, I think it's kind of interesting how the tariffs have been received in this region and how regional governments are responding. Perhaps there can be a case made that, Trump has many goals associated with his tariffs, but when he talks about how tariffs are an excellent tool to bring countries to the negotiating table, he's not wrong there. Because so far we've had, I think, delegations from Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, all visit Washington, D.C. We've had governments here in Singapore, over in Thailand and the Philippines, engage in more remote but still pretty direct communication with their counterparts in Washington about how they can lower the tariffs. It seems that, to a great extent, Trump's bet that countries would be unwilling to lose the US market is paying off.
That's clearly true, right? And that also feeds into his refusal to negotiate with the countries in the region as a bloc, right? As an ASEAN bloc. Trump has criticized multilateralism because it dilutes American power.
Yeah.
Why would America negotiate with countries as a bloc, right? Where America would be the proverbial 800-pound gorilla compared to just about any other country, right? Probably China notwithstanding, and the EU. What we also see from our perspective and with our neighbors is the classic prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
Right? Sort of where it would still behoove all of us to coordinate in terms of what bargaining positions ought to be, baseline positions, and what would benefit the region. Right? Clearly, every country has their national interests and priorities in mind, and as you point out, right, have sent their delegations to DC to negotiate as best a deal as they can. I think the problem here is, what is this going to do for regional unity, right? Sort of ASEAN unity. So we already have the case where Indonesia is talking about purchasing more oil from the US and saying, okay, right, we'll buy less oil from Singapore, right? Because Singapore is a refining hub. We're not an oil producer, right? But we are a big oil refiner. But at the same time, right, sort of Indonesia is criticizing Singapore for, right, high prices when, right, this is determined by market forces and also by the individual firms, right, sort of doing the refining and the selling. So this, I think, is the downside and the danger. That as states, again, pursuing their national interests, their priorities, engaging in beggar thy neighbor policy. So we've seen this before.
Yeah.
Right? We saw this in the 1930s after Smoot-Hawley set off trade wars and protectionist measures, and with the benefit of hindsight, right, sort of we know did not end very well. So we ought then to know better and to ensure that this does not lead us down that same path.
That being said, though, I think there have been a few voices out there expressing concern that the pressure from Trump's Liberation Day tariffs might push countries in this region specifically towards China. But I don't think it's that simple either, right? It's not necessarily that, US's loss is China's gain. It's that countries in this region have their own agency to make their decisions. And though they might, engage China a bit more, at the end of the day, their primary strategy to navigate between the great powers is still hedging.
Absolutely, right? Sort of, it is not automatic that one side's loss is another side's gain. And as you again correctly pointed out, the countries of the region have agency. And that agency means that they want to choose neither.
Yeah.
It's again back to the countries of the region wanting their cake and to eat it too, right? So they want win-win
cooperation,
win-win development, right? To be able to trade with both the US and China.
Yeah, it's like the case of Vietnam. There was a recent report in the Straits Times, I think, talking about how on the one hand you have this Trump resort or some kind of other development coming up, but at the same time Vietnam has agreed to engage China to build a new high-speed railway between Yunnan and northern Vietnam for about, I think, $10 billion? So you're right, countries in this region want to have their cake and to eat it too. But at the same time, they might just be able to do it if they are strategic and shrewd in how they conduct their foreign policy.
Absolutely.
So Adrian, what would you say are the things that you would look out for when it comes to Trump's foreign policy over the next 100 days of his term?
So I think looking forward, what we anticipate will be a more formal Indo-Pacific strategy and also a possible China strategy. And I think there, right, we will, at least at the formal level, see a great deal of continuity between Biden and Trump 2.0, just as there was continuity between Trump 1.0 and the Biden administration. Right? But of course, the complicating factor is Trump himself.
Yeah, he might have a strategy, but he might not follow it.
Exactly. There will be the official administration policy or strategy, and then there will be President Trump doing things on his own. So that's something we'll be keeping an eye on. And we'll also be keeping an eye on what happens after 90-day pause on these reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah.
We'll find out which countries have been quote-unquote successful in negotiating down reciprocal tariffs. But I would expect 10% baseline universal tariffs to remain. And that will still be, by historical standards, still very high.
Yeah.
And it's going to have repercussions for the economies in the region.
Yeah, that's true. And we might also have to expect some more targeted tariffs, like the ones on the solar industries in certain countries in Southeast Asia that came out, I think, just a few weeks ago.
Oh, yes. The administration has already put in Section 232 investigations on tariffs on pharmaceuticals, on semiconductors, right? So more tariffs, more sectoral tariffs are also in the pipeline.
The most beautiful word in the dictionary. Well, thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Kevin.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe, and we'll see you again.